So, now this will be on the video. So we typically, in the past, have done this thing called multiple choice. And if you haven't heard about it, talk to anybody who has ever taken the class, students hate it. Students hate it for a couple of reasons. One reason they hate it is because Dr. is evil and diabolical and hates students. Yeah. I mean, you may think that, but it's not true. The reason that they hate it is it removes the possibility of gaining from guessing, because you're not picking a correct answer from a suite of obviously incorrect answers. What you're doing is you're responding to a beginning prompt, and then there are a suite of potential answers that could or couldn't be correct, depending on what the nature of the answer is. So, I'll give you a foolish example, and then I'll give you a biological example.
There we go.
Okay. Multiple choice. The cool thing about multiple choice is you can't guess about any of this. You either know stuff about me or you don't know stuff about me. And the stuff that you know about me, you mark as true or false, depending on whether you know that it's true or false about me. So, am I bald? Well, I shave my head, so I'm usually bald or slightly scruffy. So, sure, we would check that, as that is correct. Do I ride bikes a lot?
Yes.
I'll bite my ass off. So you have a master's degree in biology and applied statistics. Well, you have no way of knowing that because I've never told you that before. Maybe not. In this case, maybe not, you're going to do yourself as much damage guessing as not guessing. And so the thing to do is for those things that you truly don't know anything about, don't guess, because you have a 50-50 chance of getting it right or wrong. And so you might as well just err on the side of doing nothing. There's an economist who said, you know, if I could create an economic system where making the right decision was doing nothing, that would be like the easiest solution to, you know, the easiest problem to solve. So if you don't know something, just leave it blank is generally the thing to do. If you left it blank, you would have gotten that wrong. You would have lost 1 point, but it's not catastrophic because you have all of these other points that are in this question. He does not have a PhD degree. I'm Dr. Klawinski. I better have a PhD or I've been lying to you this whole time. So you would leave that one blank. He makes mead in his spare time. You have no idea whether that's true or not.
Dr. Judd. You and Dr. Judd talked about it.
Dr. Judd and I talked about it. So you know that about me. Does that have anything to do with riding bikes? No, but I get to test you on different aspects of Paul Klawinski, just like I can test you about different aspects of natural selection or different aspects of competition in this single question. So Dr. Klawinski does make mead in his spare time. It will be ready to drink in December. It is not an instant gratification kind of thing. Do I own a pickup truck? No, I own a Prius. Am I from Texas, Luke?
Yeah.
Where's Luke? Oh, there's Luke. Am I from Texas, Luke? Yeah, I'm from Texas. So you would have, if you had not guessed here, you would have lost 1 point and you would have gotten credit for everything else. So the cool thing from an instructor's perspective about a multiple choice test is I can gain a much deeper assessment of what you know and don't know, because a single question can actually cover lots of aspects of a particular topic. The reason students hate it is because you can't guess on these. You have to have prepared in such a way that you actually know things thoroughly.
So if you had marked has a master's degree, would you still have lost a point, or is it the same thing as not?
No, because I have a master's degree. You will have just guessed correctly.
Oh no, but like if you guess wrong, then what happens? You just lose a point?
You just lose a point.
Okay.
But it's 1 point, as opposed to, you know, if you have 20 multiple choice questions, you guess wrong once, you miss the whole question, which is inevitably going to be more than 1 point.
Oh, so if you guessed wrong, you missed the whole question?
If you guess wrong on a multiple choice test, yeah.
Oh.
Because there's only one possible right answer.
As opposed to like on a multiple?
As opposed to you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 points. I mean, you could guess on everything and just through random chance miss all 7, but that's not very likely. And so the thing to do is just don't guess. Know what you know, mark those things that you do know, maybe put a circle around things that you don't know, so if something later on in the test jogs your memory, you can come back to that. Don't ever be surprised that you find answers to early questions later in a test. Well, then go back to the early part of the test and address those questions. So students hate it because it's hard to guess what the right answer is, because there's not 5 possibilities, one of which is obviously right, the others of which are obviously wrong. It's good for us because we get to test a broader base of your knowledge than a single question, which basically asks a single thing about a particular thing, because you have to create a bunch of questions, a bunch of answers that are all wrong except for the one that is right. So, so we want you to have comprehensive knowledge, and a multiple choice test is a way to do that. So basically 50 points of it are multiple choice, and 50 points of it are short answer. Now short answer is in some cases going to be us asking you a question and you're just spitting out the answer to us. In some cases it's going to be asking you to look at a figure and interpret that figure correctly. In some cases it may ask you to do some math. So on the statistics portion, there are going to be stats questions on here. And I'm just telling you right now, I'm going to ask you to calculate sample mean, sample variance, sample standard deviation, standard error of the mean, and the confidence interval, giving you a t-table so you can get the correct t-statistic from your sample size, from all that jazz. You're going to have to work that out. You're going to have to show your work on the paper so that as I grade that, I can see if you get something wrong, where did you go wrong? And I told you guys already in class, if you get the mean wrong, I'll actually go through and work the rest of the problem based on that mean that you gave me, and then I'll grade all of your subsequent answers. If you get to the standard deviation and standard error and you get that wrong, I'll grade that wrong, but then I'll take whatever your answer for the standard error was, I'll redo the calculations with that in mind to see if you got the confidence intervals right, given what you thought the standard error of the mean was. Unfair to ask you to give you the mean, you miscalculate the mean, which then necessarily makes all the rest of your answers to that question wrong. That would be unfair because you really only got one thing wrong. If you still then can use that to calculate the variance correctly based on what that incorrect mean is, then you should get credit for having that skill. I'm more concerned that you have the skill than that you have the right numerical answer on all those things.
Will we be given the formulas?
No, you will not be given the formulas. Why?
Because at that point, we aren't really testing, that you wouldn't be really testing if we understood how to get them.
Yeah, so what did I say when I started the statistics section? Am I concerned that you memorize the formulas? Am I ever going to ask you to memorize the formulas?
No.
No, what do I want you to do? I want you to be able to know how to do it. So yes, I could give you the formula, but guess what? If you don't know how to do it, is the formula really going to help you? So, What am I supposed to do with this?
Sum up what the mean minus whatever data point it is and square it, and then divide it over the number of objects or data points you have minus one.
If I didn't have that on the test, would you be able to calculate the variance?
Yeah.
Hopefully, because you calculated the variance before September 16th comes along. So if you know how to do it, you don't really need the formula. If you don't know how to do it, chances are the formula is not really going to help you. So I would prefer just not to put the formula on there and then make sure that you actually know how to do it. Once again, I know the formula not because I memorized the formula, I know the formula because I know how to calculate the variance. I create the formula from my knowledge of how to calculate the variance, not I know how to calculate the variance because I know the formula. So short answers are going to be a variety of things. True short answers, interpretation of graphs, doing math, could be lots of different things. But there'll be things about the stuff that we talked about. Multiple choice question. It's asking you about the effect of weather events, the effect of currents, the effect of time of year, all in this one question. Do hurricanes affect the climate of the Galapagos? Why not?
The area of the world the Galapagos are in don't see a lot of hurricanes.
Yeah, hurricanes generally start off the coast, off the western coast of the continent. So we get hurricanes starting off the west coast of South America, but they generally start further north in the same way that when they start off the coast of Africa, they start further north. Not to mention, did we talk about hurricanes at all? Yeah, so if you've been here every day and you don't recall us talking about hurricanes except here where we're saying hurricanes have nothing to do with anything, then you can say that's not true. They start the fact of the matter is they start further north and then they move northwest. They move away from the Galapagos rather than towards the Galapagos. Do they occur during periods when the Humboldt Current surrounds the islands? Why not, Mira?
Because the Humboldt Current is the cold current.
Humboldt Current is the cold current. They occur, you get wet periods when which current is around the Galapagos? The Panama Current. So that's not true. Don't check that. Does it get wet there during El Nino events?
Yes.
Why? It rains a lot because
The El Nino is a warm mass of
so
water.
warm mass of water surrounding the islands, that evaporation creates rainfall. Yeah, so you say, yeah, sure, it happens during El Nino events. Okay, now during the time of year, if you look at the year in the Galapagos, is there a rainier time than other times? Okay, is it in the kind of winter months or is it in the summer months?
Winter months.
In the winter months. That's a multiple choice question. But it allows me to ask you about a couple of different aspects, 3 different aspects of climate and aridity in the Galapagos Islands. Which is the beauty of it from an instructor's perspective. I really get a sense of what you remember from what we covered in class. And if you could answer the questions in committee, you would probably do pretty well. But you have to answer the questions alone. Okay? Does that help at all? Yeah. All right, cool, great. Other questions? We were here, weren't we? Were we talking about the niche at the end last
Yeah.
time? Okay. I think we covered everything I wanted to cover on the niche. We talked about different organisms having different adaptations to their specific environments. One of you mentioned fish. The fish is a very general thing, and then we talked about parrotfishes, which are a specific type of fish that feeds on corals, and so they're going to have particular morphology that matches that. So, any questions about that? All right, so the video that you guys watched talked about a couple of different groups of organisms. I want to concentrate on tortoises, because tortoises are actually one of the first groups of organisms that Darwin started paying attention to when he started thinking about evolution. Darwin's finches get a lot of credit because a lot more work has been done on them, but when he was on his way back from the Galapagos Islands, he was reflecting on his time in the Galapagos Islands, and he recalls having conversations with people there who talked about the fact that they could distinguish tortoises from different islands simply on the basis of the shape of their shells. And this drove home to him this idea that they were all similar in certain ways, but they were all distinct depending on what island they came from. And they talked about this in the video. So when you look at the islands as a whole, you see San Cristobal over here, you see Isabella over here. What's the age of San Cristobal relative to the age of Isabella and Fernandina?
Cristobal is
Cristobal is older, it's much older. And so 2.4 to 4 million years old as opposed to just, 35,000, wait, what is that? It's a million years. Wait. I get it right. 350,000 to 70,000 years old. So Fernandina is much younger than San Cristobal. I have to do the calculations in my head. So when we look at these tortoises have different shaped carapaces. This is the one that Darwin was actually talking about when he talks about Charles Porter, or Captain Porter has described those from Charles Island and from the nearest island to it, namely Hood Island, as having their shells, that's misspelled, in front thick and turned up like a Spanish saddle. And the one that he's talking about is this guy right here. You see that there's this deep cleft in the carapace of the tortoise. This one doesn't have a deep cleft, this one has an intermediate cleft. Why do these tortoises have this cleft? So they can reach up and grab these cacti that have this tree-like growth form. And so this would be considered to be an adaptation that fits in with their niche of being a cactus-feeding tortoise. Well, you can reconstruct the evolutionary history of tortoises by looking at their DNA. This is an analysis from this paper by Grant and et al. 2008. They didn't do the work, they're actually taking this from other people. But one of the things that you find is that these tortoises tend to group together. All of these species of tortoises are found on the island of Isabella. Isabella and Floriana are right next to one another, and the species from Isabella and Floriana are right next to one another in this phylogeny, showing the evolutionary relationships among these tortoises. Pinta, Espanola, and San Cristobal, these are old tortoise species, and they happen to be on the oldest islands in the archipelago. And so you oftentimes will find that if you've created a hypothesis for the evolutionary relationships between a group of organisms, when you then look at their geography, what you see is that evolutionary tree showing those relationships will also be easy to map onto geography. Now, that's not always the case. There's a lot of phenotypic variation in snail shape from island to island. And this is one of the things that makes shell systematics and phylogeny very difficult, because when you look at the shells and you do a genetic analysis on them, one of the things that you find is that there's some grouping by island, but then there's a lot of spread of islands across this whole thing. So we have Santiago here, we have Santiago way down here and here and here. And so in this case, the islands look like they've had a much more complex interaction with snails, but it's probably because these snails evolved from marine snails that came out of the ocean and colonized land, and they probably colonized land over and over again, and then shell shape becomes convergent, because shell shape is all about how the snail adapts to the climate that it finds itself in. So if you evolve in a dry climate, you're going to evolve a particular morphology of the shell of the snail, simply because you have a snail shell that is evolved and adapted to reduce water loss, because you don't have good ways of regulating water, because you're basically this slimy, oozy bag of liquid inside of a shell. And so you get a lot of different kinds of shells distributed across this tree simply because of climate. You find this kind of shell down here, and this one in places that are dry. You find these broader shells in places that are moister, regardless of what your evolutionary relationship might be to a sister taxon. And so in this case, it's much better to look at genes to determine what the evolutionary relationships are among individuals than it is to look at morphology. We can't forget plants in all of this. Plants also have variations and adaptations that help them to colonize islands and then survive there. We've talked about cacti. Cacti are interesting because when we look at cacti, we oftentimes see the big green, what look like leaves of the cactus, but those are actually stems, and they're stems that basically allow the cactus to store a lot of moisture, a lot of water, which allows them to survive in arid places that the galapagos are. And the needles are actually the leaves. And so the needles of the cactus are the leaves, and this represents an extreme example of reduction of leaf size. When you find plants living in arid environments, you often find that they reduce leaf size. If you're from Texas or from the Southwest, mesquite trees have these little tiny leaves. They have thorns to protect them from herbivores, but the critical thing to think about is they have these little tiny leaves because they're trying to reduce water loss across the leaf surface. Dr. Judd talked earlier about mangroves. Mangroves have a propagule that floats in the water and allows that thing to be transported by ocean currents from island to island. When it makes landfall, it then germinates, and it puts out these long roots, and these long roots are much above the water line. So this is the base of the plant. This is where soil would normally be if this thing were planted in soil, but they put out these stalked roots that help keep the main body of the plant out of the ocean water as tides change. And so tides will bring the water level up, and then it'll drop back down, or bring the water level up and drop back down, and it keeps the vegetative part of the plant, the above ground part of the plant, up out of the water. Keeps it from being damaged by salt, and keeps it from rotting by being constantly submerged in water. So lots of ways in which organisms got to islands, and lots of ways in which they survived and thrived once they got to the island. And so let's talk about factors that affect how many species occur on an island. What do you guys think are going to be important for affecting the number of species on an island?
Fresh water supply.
Okay, so having a freshwater supply, is there any aspect of an island that would help a island have freshwater supply? Okay, springs possibly, but what else did we talk about when we talked about climate and topography?
Weather.
Mountains, why? Mountains.
Because the water, or the air that's like coming off the ocean moves up the mountains and
So mountainous areas, mountainous islands will have more species, partly because they have more water. That's because of what we call adiabatic cooling. This cooling of air as it goes up in elevation that causes water to condense and rainfall to form and rain down on island. What else might influence the number of species on an island?
Predators.
Okay, certainly the presence of predators might have an effect. Is that going to be a general characteristic of an island or a specific peculiarity of an island? Is that a general thing or a specific thing? And is it more a characteristic of an island of itself? Or is it a contingent factor? Like you might or might not have predators on an island.
So contingent factor.
Yeah, it seems to me to
Yeah.
be more contingent. It might have an effect, but of course, the predator had to get there first, had to get there. So my question is, what things affect? So maybe a better way of stating that, maybe this is a terrible question. What factors affect the number of species of an island? What are the two kind of fundamental processes you have to think about when you think about an island in the ocean that bubbled up from the bottom of the ocean? How do you get organisms there?
The water mass.
Okay, so you can have them rafting there. You can have them flying.
Transplanted, like you're talking about, like if birds fly over there and they can see each other.
What do we call these things? Stowaways. Stowed away on a bird and got dropped over on an island. What's going to affect your ability to get to this island? Yeah.
How far away it is, like from a main source of, species.
So all of these species that get to this island came from someplace. They came from a continent, typically. And so if this island is really far away, there are going to be fewer individuals making it there than if this island of the same size is close. Except that I made the island bigger. I should make that island closer in size to the island that I drew a minute ago. So if it's near, you're just going to get more species on that island simply because there's a greater possibility that if you leave this continent, you're going to get to this island. So that's an inherent characteristic of the island that affects how many species are there, and that has everything to do with the rate at which that island gets colonized. What about the other inherent characteristics of the island that might affect the number of species?
How old the island is, so how long species have had to diversify specifically for this island.
Okay. So that certainly is the case. It actually ends up not having much of an effect when you look at empirical data, but I can see why it could have an effect. Yeah, Jackson.
The size of the island.
Why size?
Because
Somebody
it's,
else. Jackson, calling somebody else.
let's go with Luke.
What's this about a factor? Is that what you're asking?
Why would size be a factor?
There's more size, I guess there's more room for things to grow. I don't know, vegetation.
Yeah, there's more space.
options with-
There's more space. With more space comes more resources. With more space, oftentimes comes a greater diversity of resources. And so, in the same way that, what's the size of your dorm rooms?
Tiny.
Or like 10 by 6.
8 by 10, 10 by 6? Oh, 10 by 6, that's like a jail cell.
It's like,
That's like a jail cell.
At least they get their own bathroom.
So, you're in a dormitory room. How many people do you have in your dorm? Two. Why don't they put 10 in there? Probably kill each other. Well, because the space just can't accommodate 10. It would be ridiculous to think that you could put 10 people in a dorm room and that they would be able to live there. There's just not enough physical space, and if space is a resource by itself, that's important. But anyway, think of it like your dorm room. If you had a dorm room that was 40 by 40, would you mind having more than 2 people in your dorm room? Well, probably not, because there's enough space and enough room to go around. And so we can think about ecological space being not just physical space, like how big is the island, but you can also think of it as how many resources are there, what's the total amount of resources, and what's the diversity of resources. Now, a small montane island can pack on more species than a small flat island, because once again, the topography provides greater diversity in resources, greater diversity in climate. Also, it makes the total surface area of the island greater because you've got these mountains poking up in it in the middle of it. So it turns out island size is also an important factor in determining the number of species. Now, those other things that we were talking about, topography has an effect, presence of predators has an effect, but you don't get to have a predator on an island until you're on an island that's big enough to support predators. Small islands oftentimes don't support predators because there's not enough of a prey base to support a predator. So a predator may colonize that island, but then it goes extinct because there's not enough food on the island to support a predator. That's then an island size effect. I want you to read this paragraph because I've tried to find summaries of island biogeographic theory that are really good short synopses of it, and this is the best that I've been able to find. So just take a minute and read it. Everybody done? All right, I don't know how fast people read. Some people are faster, some people are slower. So what this is driving home is the importance of these 2 fundamental factors. How far is the island from a continental source pool of species? That determines rates of colonization. The lower the rate of colonization, the fewer species you have, that low rate of colonization because you're an island that's very far from a continental source pool of species. Bigger islands can have more species because there are more resources there. Smaller islands have fewer species. And it's the balance between the 2 of these that became known as classic island biogeographic theory. So back in the old days, and in Darlington 1958, showed that, for example, for reptiles in the Caribbean, the bigger the island you were, the more species you had. So these are really small islands. These are kind of intermediate to large islands, and these are the biggest islands in the Caribbean. And if you graph the area of the island on a logarithmic scale and the number of species on a logarithmic scale, you get this relationship that is a relationship that has been repeated for archipelagos all over the world, time and time and time again. This is a relationship that works in the Caribbean for amphibians, it works for reptiles, it works for birds, it works for spiders, it works for beetles, it works for flies. All of these studies have been done on islands in the Caribbean, and it always works out the same way. Small islands with few species, large islands with large species. But then, did you have a question? Your hand was up. No, okay, you were just stretching or something a minute ago. I saw it, I just didn't get to it. So MacArthur and Wilson put together this idea that basically said that islands, the species richness on an island is determined by these 2 factors, island size and distance. And island size is going to affect two fundamental rates, the rate of colonization or immigration and the rate of extinction. So be sure that you notice that on the x-axis here is the number of species. The number of species is from 0 up to some maximum number that is the number in the source pool of species. So P is the number of species here. So if this is South America, which is what it would be for the Galapagos Islands, it would be the number of bird species in South America. That's the maximum possible number of species you could have in the Galapagos, because that's the nearest continent to the Galapagos. Now, you're not gonna get anywhere near those. Why? You're not gonna get anywhere near that maximum number.
Is the island smaller?
Because islands are smaller, so first of all, you can't pack all those species onto a single island that's really tiny relative to the size of South America. Why else? Not all of them are gonna leave South America and go to the Galapagos, or some of them will leave and they'll just perish before they get there because they're poor dispersers. They'll get partway out there and they'll die because they weren't up to the trip. So the ocean serves as kind of a filter for dispersal. The strength of that filter is going to be determined by how long you spend in that filter. And so this rate of immigration, you'll notice that it goes down as you get more and more species in the island. Why is that the case? That's the better answer, is the second one. Let's say you have 10 species. In your pool of species, species 1 migrates to this island. The next individual that arrives is species 2. You now have 2 species on the island. The third one that arrives is species number 9. But then the fourth individual that arrives on the island is species 1. Have you added anything to the count? No, because that colonist already has a representative on that island. So the more species you get on the island, the fewer species you gain in the future because a lot of those species have already arrived. So as the number of species increases, the rate of immigration goes down simply because new individuals coming in, they're not new anymore. It doesn't do anything to increase the number of species. If you're the first couple of species to arrive, the chances of there being another member of your species on that island are relatively low. Extinction rate goes up as the number of species increases. Why?
Competing for resources.
They're competing for resources, which actually has to do with the first part of your answer. So your answer was not at all wrong in its completeness. It's just that you gave both reasons within the same answer. Competition for resources. The more individuals you have needing a resource, the higher the competition. As you pack more and more species on there, it gets harder and harder for species to survive because competition becomes stiffer and stiffer. And so as you get more species on an island, extinction rate goes up, and you have these two curves crossing at a particular point, and that then is the equilibrium species count for that island. Now keep in mind that you can have different immigration rates and different extinction rates. So somebody come up here and let's assume that this is the immigration rate for a near island, and let's say that this is the extinction rate for a large island. And I need 2 volunteers to come up and draw the immigration rate for a far island and immigration rate for a far island and the extinction rate for a small island.
This is for island far, right?
Green is for immigration, purple is for extinction. Are you guys in the same group?
Yeah.
You guys are in the same group? Are you in the same group?
No.
Alright, you guys really need to get in your group areas so I can see you, because I'm about to give you some participation points. I can't tell who's who, because you're not spatially distributed. Charlie, you're over here?
Yeah.
What group is that?
BBB.
All right, and Jonas? You are where?
Bill 9.
Bill 9. All right. Somebody from your same group explain why Carly drew that way.
The immigration rate would be lower because the island's farther away.
It would be lower because the island's further away. Exactly. Somebody from this group, why is the extinction rate drawn that way?
Since there's less resources on the smaller island, extinction rate is higher.
Yeah, so here you have 4 different equilibria. An equilibrium for far islands that are small, they have the lowest number of species because they're way far away and they're tiny. Can't get there, and once you're there, it's harder to survive because there are fewer resources. This is the equilibrium point for large islands that are near, and in between that are far, large, and near small, which is exactly what you would expect. And the specifics of the immigration and extinction curves determines what happens with those in the middle, but it's always the far small ones at the low end and the near large ones at the high end for species richness. The immigration or colonization rate is determined by distance. The extinction is determined by size. So they busted down this complicated issue of what island size, or what the number of species on an island is going to be. They busted it down into these 2 fundamental rates that are basically reflective of 2 fundamental characteristics of islands. And it's been amazingly robust since it was first proposed in the 1960s. So, which type of island do you expect to have the highest number of species? More isolated or less isolated?
Less isolated.
More species? Oh yeah, less isolated. Greater habitat diversity or less habitat diversity?
Greater habitat.
Greater habitat diversity. Lower elevation or higher elevation?
Higher elevation.
Higher elevation, why?
Right.
Because of greater habitat diversity, duh. Larger area or smaller area? Larger area, why? Because of greater habitat diversity and just a greater number of resources altogether. You guys are very good at this game. Oh, why is this doing this? Okay. So McCarthy and Wilson proposed this, and I basically, these are Dr. Judd's slides from before, so I'm just blowing through all this. We've already worked through all of this. So this equilibrium is dynamic. Even though the number of species may not change from time to time, the actual identity of those species will change. So one species might go extinct on an island, it gets replaced by another species, the number of species is still the same, even though the identity of those species may be different. And so it's a simplified model, which is nice because it works in spite of its simplicity. It has been really robust over the years, being applied to lots of different island systems. What does it leave out? So it has diversity in it, because that's what species richness is. Essentially, it's just one measure of diversity. And it allows for change because, you know, there's this turnover of species on the islands. What is it not accounting for?
The change in climate a couple times.
So certainly that can happen. Let's say you're a tiny island way far away from the nearest continental source pool of species. How often are species going to arrive on your tiny island? Not very often. So if you do get a species that becomes established on this tiny island out in the middle of nowhere, think Hawaii, is it going to increase in species richness very quickly if it's just depending upon immigration to get species there?
No.
But if you're in isolation, what else can be happening on that island?
You can get.
You can have evolution occurring. evolution can increase species richness because the species that is there expands, fills up the island, and then now there's more competition and they begin to divide resources, develop different ways of exploiting those resources, and over time they can diversify into multiple species. In the Hawaiian Islands, there are 700 species of fruit flies. Are these fruit flies the results of 700 different colonization events? No, they're actually the result of one colonization event that diversified into 700 different species. Because fruit flies are really tiny, they don't need a ton of resources, so there's lots of resources in Hawaii for them to use. They flew off as they expanded their population size into all these different resources, and they found that because these islands were mountainous, that the environments in these different places and the types of foods in these different places were all different, and they began dividing up that resource among themselves, and over time, they evolved into 700 relatively specialized species of fruit flies. Yeah.
Since like flies reproduce like super quick, does that mean evolution could come a lot quicker than in comparison to like other species?
Potentially. So generation time does have an effect, and when you look at evolutionary models in the literature, the axis for time is almost always generations, number of generations, not number of years, because then it puts everybody on the same time scale. Sure. So in terms of number of years, yeah, if you can have multiple generations in a single year, per year evolution can be greater, but on a generational aspect, probably not so. Does that make sense? So the one thing that their model, well, the model ignores a lot of things, but a big one that it ignores is this idea of evolution. So MacArthur and Wilson proposed this in 1963, and then there's this guy named Daniel Simmerloff who comes along and said, hey, that's a pretty cool idea that's going to be really difficult to test, but I have an idea on how to test it. I'm going to go to Florida, and I'm going to identify these little mangrove islands. They're tiny little mangrove islands. They're so tiny that it's possible to build a structure around those mangrove islands, cover that structure in plastic sheeting, and then haul some exterminators out onto these little mangrove islands on boats and get them to kill everything on the island. Then take down the structure, take down the plastic, and then watch to see what happens as these little islands that are pretty close to the coast of Florida, as they become repopulated with species. And what they found was that you start off with they're all dead because they killed them all, and over time they gain species, and over enough time, in this case 680 days after defaunation, you see that in many cases they ended up at very close to the number of species that they had before they defaunated them, because these islands are determined in terms of their species richness by these two fundamental issues. How big is the island, and how far away is the island from a source pool of species that can colonize it? They did it off the coast of Florida with these mangrove islands because they were small, but they varied in size, and because they were relatively close to the coastline, so that the colonization rates are generally high. And so this is a cool experimental verification that this idea actually works. Questions about any of this? Okay, I need you to get in your teams, and I need you to designate one person as the player. And you need to gather around this person with their iPad. So somebody in your group needs to have an iPad. This is a little quiz. The team that gets the most points will get a participation point added to their total for today. It gives you a set of answers, and if I recall correctly, the answers have little shapes beside them, and on your screen you pick the shape that corresponds to the correct answer. This is a multiple choice quiz, not a multiple choice quiz. There is always one answer that is correct. So log on to Kahoot. And let's play. So we're gonna be in team mode. So the thing that you need to do is you need to put your team name. I hate this stupid music. Put your team name into the Kahoot. This is the pin that you need to get in the game. Put your team name in so that when it saves it at the end, I'll know which team to assign your points to. Also, at the end of each one, it tells you who's leading. I think it actually tells you the top 3 people, so since there are 3 teams, it will tell you where everybody stands. I'm waiting for teams. You guys figured it out?
It takes a minute to get in.
Oh. No, not everybody's name. You're doing my sense, right?
Yeah, but you are allowed to ask for all.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, you don't need all your names.
So you
I need Bubba.
You have to.
Oh, did it make you?
And that's like,
You could just rewrite the first letter.
I wonder if it'll save it over time. Some people hate the music, some people love the music.
Oh, okay, I thought you were saying you did like
It'd be nice if it wasn't the same thing.
so I would be referring to numbers. When I'm saying 1, it's not 1, 2 is not 1. Just
Alright, all 3 teams are
That's
in.
an easy way.
Is everybody ready to go? What you guys have to do is decide as quickly as you can among yourselves what the right answer is. Get whatever team member is doing the playing to enter it.
Wait, can y'all? Can y'all?
Can you guys move over so they can see? What do you mean you can't get the right answer?
We need those points, okay?
You already got one.
Take whatever entry you can get.
We're ready?
Yep.
Can you guys see?
You're just being a lot.
Come to the middle a little bit. You guys move over there a little bit. You guys are all in wheelie chairs. It's easy to move. Turn around. Well, you have to see the screen. So, actually, move on the other side. Come around. Debbie, come around and let her be behind you so that they can be looking and just see it. I can see all this.
She doesn't tell you.
Grab her up. Right, are we ready? On your mark, get set, go. All right, everybody got it right.
I'm sorry.
Wait, it died.
So everybody got it right. Bill Nye Science Guys got more points because they answered more quickly.
We're
So this is-
tied.
We're tied.
And you answered at the same time. All right, let's go. You guys are killing it. Nice. You have to think about that. Why not reduce root systems?
That was an accident.
Oh, okay.
Root systems are for nutrients, not.
You should have expansive root systems if you live in an arid area because you want to be harvesting as much water from the ground as possible. Right. Next. Everybody gets to the end of the answers and it's like, that's the answer. Last question. Now this is rainfall variation, not rainfall total. Okay, why is El Nino the right answer for variation?
Because it's a warm body that runs more water or more rain.
Okay, so that could contribute to rainfall, but why is it variation? It happens every so often, it brings a lot, and then it goes away for years and years, so it leads to variability. Yeah. Alright,
Good job.
I would laugh if we wouldn't have
it looks like BioBusters got the point. Nice job.
I literally put this yeah. It's all about
So, focus. Bring it back in focus. Participation points are sometimes for just having the guts to go to the board and do something when your colleagues didn't have the guts to go to the board and do something. Sometimes you get points for being faster and more accurate than some other people. You would have gotten participation points whether the lines you drew on the board were correct or not. And the fact that you had members of your team who could also explain why you put those lines on the board and explain those correctly. You know, that's what we're going for, is being correct. But you don't have to always be correct, and you're not always going to be judged on your correctness or not. Sometimes it's just having the guts to get out there and put yourself out there and risk being wrong. That's part of what participation is. If you were always right about things, you would never be learning anything because you presumably knew it all before we started covering it. All right, I'm going to start natural selection in the couple of minutes that we have left. Because we're now a little bit behind. You can stay where you are, or you can move around. So a big focus of this first case study is on the theory of evolution via natural selection. So I want to tell you a little bit about kind of the way this came into being, because it's useful to know. I lost my pointer somewhere. Oh, here it is. So Darwin was this guy who was brought up in a relatively well-off family in England, and he discovered this concurrently with Wallace, and we'll say why Darwin gets more credit than Wallace does here in a little while. Alfred Russel Wallace was also an Englishman, but came from a very different upbringing than Darwin did. Darwin had all the advantages. His family had money, he got a really good education, he had the money to go away on a 5-year voyage as ship's naturalist on the HMS Beagle. And while he was there, he got these ideas about evolution. He took Principles of Geology, written by Charles Lyell, which was the first modern treatment of geology. And he read that. He actually left England with volume 1 of Principles of Geology, and he had volume 2 and volume 3 sent to him when he was in South America, so that he had, by the time he got back, he had read all 3 of these. The reason for that is going to become important in a little while. He returned with tons of specimens, and he started thinking about these ideas about evolution and natural selection while he was on the boat, and it took him a number of years to get that all into an abstract, but it was actually about 200 pages long, if I recall correctly, this abstract, this rough outline of his idea. And then, sorry, that's wrong, that's not 1835. He got a letter from Wallace in 1858. That should be 1858. I don't know why that says 1835. And in that letter, 1858. 18, you can't see that anyway, because that marker is dead. 1858 is what that should say. And clearly on crack today. All right, 1858. So in 1858, he got a letter from this guy named Alfred Russel Wallace, who had been corresponding with him for years, and said, hey, I have this idea. Here's a paper that I've written about it. Could you read it at the meeting of the Linnean Society of London? And sure enough, the ideas in this 1858 letter ended up being the very ideas that Darwin had been thinking about since 1836, essentially. And so what did Darwin observe? He observed that species on islands were similar but different from those on the nearest continent. He proposed that dispersal was followed by descent modification. He wondered what process could achieve this modification. He thought that whatever the process was, it probably took a really long time to accomplish, but that didn't jive with the thoughts in the world at the time, which was that the Earth was only about 6,000 years old. And people had calculated the age of the Earth by going to the Bible and literally counting up the number of generations in the Bible and looking at the age of those people who are mentioned in the Bible, and they arrived at something along the lines of about 6,000 years for the total age of the Earth. And that wasn't nearly enough time for a gradual process to have resulted in the type of variation that he was seeing. So when he read Principles of Geology, one of the things that Charles Lyell said in Principles of Geology is that the same processes, the same physical processes that are leading to change in geological formations today are the same processes that have always been leading to geological change. Mountain building, erosion, oceanic uplifts, volcanism, all of these things change the geology of the face of the Earth, but they're all amazingly slow. And so you get the Grand Canyon not because God trudged out the Grand Canyon so that we could all enjoy it. You get the Grand Canyon through millions and millions of years of erosion. You get the Himalayan mountains not because God built them up so that mountain climbers would have a place to go and die. They occurred because the subcontinent of India is slamming into the continent of Asia and pushing those mountains up higher and higher each year. And so when Darwin read Principles of Geology, he discovered that the Earth was much older than they previously thought, and there was finally enough time for these changes, these evolutionary changes to occur. And so Alfred Russel Wallace, he traveled throughout South America like Darwin did, but then he also went to Indonesia. He had a very bad time in South America. If you want to know about it, I can tell you about it. But in Indonesia, he lived in an archipelago, so he was also exposed to islands in the same way that Darwin was exposed to islands, and noticed the same types of things that Darwin had noticed. He had the benefit of all of Lyell's writing because he was younger. He went later in the 1840s and 50s, and he also had Darwin's writings. And so in 1858, he asked Darwin to read a paper he had written at the meeting of the Linnean Society. And when Darwin got it, he was like, oh crap, this idea that I've had since 1836, that I've been sitting on all these years, this guy from Indonesia has now scooped me. And he went to people who he had been talking to about his ideas, people like Charles Lyell and Robert Poker, some of the great luminaries of the day, and said, okay, I've now been scooped, what do I do? They were familiar, they had read his 1844 abstract and had been talking to him about the development of all of this, and they said, okay, we'll go with you and we'll read your two papers together. Go back home, write up a brief abstract of your long abstract, and one of us will read Darwin's paper, one of us will read Wallace's paper, and they appear basically together in the 1858 issue of the Journal of the Linnean Society of London as two companion papers. The reason Darwin gets the credit is because he had been working on this for literally a couple of decades before this happened, and as a result, it was very easy for him to take that long abstract from 1844, convert that into book form, and get a book published in 1859 that you guys all know probably as The Origin of Species. And so he takes most of the credit because he had the more fully fleshed out version of the theory, but they both had the same idea. Darwin had it earlier, but it didn't get published until the same time as one another. And on Monday, we'll start by talking about what exactly this idea entails. Questions? What are you bringing to class on Monday?
Summary.
Introduction of your literature summary of the Dendria algae. We'll spend some time on natural selection, and then we'll spend the rest of the class on He's not. He's out at another university giving a talk. Do you need something?
He's my advisor.
Okay. I can answer that if there's a question about something.
Well, I got the opportunity to shadow a surgeon, but I'm already missing a class. So,
This class?
like all of my classes.
Oh, as an academic advisor, he should probably advise you to not do that.
But it's like a really good opportunity to get shadowing hours.
Well, okay, but if you can't go to any of your classes, you have to ask yourself, am I going to be able to perform adequately in my classes? Or am I going to drop out of school for some in order to do the shadowing?
It's just for like one day though.
Oh, but, okay, you have to give your advisor complete information.
Sorry. It's just for one day.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's just like any other absence, you just take the day and, you know, make up the work.
Thank
I'm
you.
in the same classroom, so it's thank you. Sorry, I was like pushing on. No, it's all
Yeah.
good.
It's just the equilibrium point, it's what will occur.
He was totally
This
thinking like I'm missing the rest of it. He's like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna drop out of school and go do this. I'll bye.
Yeah, I'm just gonna drop out of school for the rest of the semester.
So,
Totally.
it's kind of like a supply and demand curve. Now, supply curve and demand curve, and where there's two things determines what the price is.
I'm nervous for
If
shit class.
supply goes
For
up,
what?
For
then price
Oxford,
goes
I'm
down
so
because of the way
nervous.
those two
So we're
curves
just talking about that. I'm so confused about all of it. So like,
intersect with one another. So it is high price or low price, everything are bad.
I'm gonna go back
It's just that if you have a certain
and
amount of demand and a certain amount of supply,
take my
that
tablet
thing
and
is
this morning.
I'm hoping that it wasn't a radio
So you can think of this as.
but you know,
as
maybe that would be a good thing.
cross that.
What?
Are radioactive
No,
cells
like Spider-Man.
If you shift the integration curve up,
Yeah.
maybe
Thanks for scaring me for a minute.
then the number of species that that item has goes up because you move one of those curves. So it's just a theoretical model, conceptual model, to help you figure out what you should expect on islands with a given amount of information and a given amount of species based on the distance from the size of it. So that's why I showed you, you can add curves to it, and actually in New York, they have essentially this figure.
Kind of made me think like cattle, like you have one cattle, 2 acres or 1.5 acres, kind of depending on what you are. And that's like the desired amount of species per land continent.
Yeah, so, you know, in their original publication, they had this figure drawn. And this would have been, this is extinction of large islands, small islands. This is immigration of near islands, far islands and near islands. So then at the bottom, they were like, this is far small from 0 to the maximum number of species. This is large near, and then far, large, and near small for somewhere in the middle. So these are what the shape of these curves are in their positions are all determined by the characteristics of the island. So it's not that it's good or bad to have more species or fewer species. It's just this is just the way it's figured out. This is why I decided to take up Wednesday.
Yes. I'm sorry. I was looking at this. I've seen